And so to our speaker. Shailaja Paik is Associate Professor of History and Affiliate in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Cincinnati. Her first book, Dalit Women's Education in Modern India, Double Discrimination, examines the nexus between caste, class, gender, and state pedagogical practices among Dalit untouchable women in urban India. Her second book, The Vulgarity of Caste, Dalit Sexuality and Humanity, focuses on the politics of caste, class, gender, sexuality, and popular culture in modern Maharashtra. She's working on her third monograph, Becoming Vulgar, Caste Domination and Normative Sexuality in Modern India, and is co-editing a book on Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Her research is founded by the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Institute of Indian Studies, and the Charles Phelps Taft Research Center, among many others. Dr. Paik has published several articles on a variety of themes, including the politics of naming, Dalit and African American women, Dalit women's education, and new Dalit womanhood in colonial India, in prestigious international journals. Her scholarship and research interests are concerned with contributing to and furthering the dialogue in human rights, anti-colonial struggles, transnational women's history, women of color, feminisms, and particularly on gendering, caste, and subaltern history. Dr. Paik also co-organized the 5th International Conference on the Unfinished Legacy of Dr. Ambedkar at the New School of Social Research in October 2019. So I think it's obvious from this even brief introduction that we have perhaps the very best person in the world here to join us, to guide us through her presentation on Dr. Ambedkar and her Indian Revolution, fighting caste, gender, sexuality, and forging a new womanhood. So please welcome Shailaja Paik.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Steve, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Tina, for organizing my talk here. Thank you all for joining us today in celebrating the great revolutionaries. And I am going to speak about India's one of the most formidable leaders and a revolutionary thinker, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar was a revolutionary leader, intellectual, activist, and architect of India's constitution. He was a significant political thinker, scholar, and commentator who critically influenced the construction of India's political modernity. He was modern India's most original thinkers, yet his efforts are barely recognized. He struggled for Dalits and overall Indians' claim to human recognition, human dignity, and political significance. As a result of these efforts, he occupies a critical space in public memory in terms of portraits, calendars, statues, songs, street theater, and much more. Only recently, some scholars have turned their attention to Dr. Ambedkar and have produced some book-length monographs. However, there is less discussion on his contribution to the analysis of the intersections of caste, gender, and sexuality. And I have tried to do so in my work, and this is what I will be talking about today. And before I delve deeper, I just wanted to show you some pictures of Dr. Ambedkar. I'm very sure some of you are familiar, with him, but just to, put my talk in a broader context and to see the person who I am talking about, I'm just going to share my screen here. Are you able to see my screen, Tina?
We can, yes, if you could just put it in slideshow mode, that would be perfect.
Thank you.
And there's a bar at the top, if you can just hit hide.
Yes. Thanks, Tina.
Thank you.
So to begin with, I think it is important to understand the caste structure. The caste structure consists of about 4 main caste communities: the priests, scholars, Brahmins at the top, the Kshatriya or the warriors, the second, the Vaishya or the businessmen and the traders, followed by farmers and menial workers. And the former untouchables and Dalits actually have an ambiguous status. They are outcasts, they are the lowest in this structure, and they are not actually included in the caste structure. And they are the lowest of the communities in this structure. This is a picture of Dr. Ambedkar, and in most parts of India, you'll come across this picture with a book in his hand, which is the Constitution, and pointing out the direction that humanity should follow with his right finger up there. I have one more picture here with Dr. Ambedkar in the center, and with Dalit radicals in early 20th century Bombay Presidency. So we have Dr. Ambedkar here in the center, surrounded by his co-associates. This is another picture of Dalit radicals in 20th century Bombay Presidency. And here's a picture of Dr. Ambedkar with Dalit women in Mumbai. And this is how, through his speeches, conferences, he tried to organize women's movement, and he argued for Dalit women's empowerment. The lives of Dalit women, who were at the center of political, social, and historical change in early and mid-19th century India, were precarious and fraught with productive paradoxes. Addressing a gathering of Dalit women at the Mahad conference held from December 25th to 27th, 1927, the anti-caste intellectual and formidable leader of modern India, Dr. Ambedkar, emphasized the qualities Dalit women possessed to generate a new Dalit modernity in India. And I quote, so he told these forms, so Dalit is the other word used for former untouchables. And so this is what Dr. Ambedkar had to say to Dalit women. I quote, "You must realize that you possess much virtue, character, and purity like that of the high caste woman. Moreover, you have the tenacity of mind, resoluteness, willpower, and daring, something that the highest caste woman lacks. So you should now pledge that you will not live in a degraded, stigmatized condition henceforth." End quote. So the Brahmin man, the highest caste man, was rendered the highest human by the Indian society, and the Brahmin woman, the ideal Indian woman. Ambedkar challenged the naturalized and normalized privilege of Brahmin caste status and argued for equality between Brahmins and Dalits. He recontextualized virtue within the political economy of caste slavery and troubled the distinctions between the supposedly virtuous Brahmin high caste woman and the quote-unquote fallen Dalit untouchable woman. He provoked both respectable Dalit women and presumably dishonorable Dalit prostitutes, hitherto excluded by touchables, to attend to the enormity of their degradation, discrimination, and violated condition. In so doing, Ambedkar emphasized Dalit women's role as a driving force in history and reinforced their fundamental commitment to dignity, self-development, and agency for personal and community freedom. Claims to Dalit women's bodies is a continued testimony to touchable privilege, mastery, and superiority. Hence, many Dalit radicals, including Ambedkar, resented and bitterly protested touchable men's continued and persistent insulting of Dalit women. They felt wronged when touchable women and men pointed to the perceived immorality of Dalits, and especially some Dalit women, as evidence of their inferiority, failing to consider how those perceptions were the result of historical processes and the sexual economy of caste. To counter this, Ambedkar addressed women in public meetings, reinforced their individual and collective agency as political subjects, and engaged them as legal subjects. Dalit radicals offered an internal critique of the practices of caste, gender, and sexuality, but it was Ambedkar who attempted to civilize, modernize, and legitimize the Dalit self in the community on a social, political, cultural, and deeper psychic level in order to make Dalits fearless citizens of the modern Indian nation. Yet there were uncertainties, anxieties, ambiguities, and contradictions as Ambedkar exercised his authority. Considered jewels of the community, civilized, morally upright, and respectable Dalit women were central forces who were driving social change and constituting Dalit power. So how did Ambedkar work on Dalit women's empowerment? Ambedkar analyzed the woman question that reconfigured the meanings of affect, labor, and dignity. He worked on Dalit women's suffering and stigma to carve out radical possibilities for self-respect, dignified humanity, self-reliance, equality, freedom in a regional and doubly colonized context. To do this, Ambedkar adopted a number of strategies. His and Dalit women's political strategy centered on constituting a new and ideal Dalit woman, the radical remaking of the self and the construction of subjectivity, so that it was not merely a recovery of women, as feminist historians have argued, in the context of imperial and elite women. The colonial government, social reform movements, and the feminist movement were little concerned with the Dalit question and denied Dalits a space to critique gender, caste, and untouchability. Although touchable middle-class women shared social and educational exclusion with the lower castes and gendered identity with Dalit women, they still failed to include the latter in their liberal feminist movement. It was Ambedkar who made Dalit women's caste and gendered bodies more visible and articulated an inclusive analysis and politics against caste and gender hierarchies that anticipated more recent feminist analysis. So how did Ambedkar do this? So my first theme is the sex-gender caste trouble. In 1916, a 25-year-old Ambedkar argued that the special burden of Dalit women was due to the interlocking technologies of caste, gender, and sexuality. Refuting claims of other scholars of caste, Ambedkar underscored the significance of endogamy, that is, the closed-door system of marriage rooted in numerical equality between the sexes, as the fundamental characteristic or essence of caste. He argued, and I quote, "Endogamy is the key to the mystery of the caste system. It is only through the maintenance of inequality between the sexes that the necessary endogamy of the group can be kept intact. End quote. By initiating this intellectual inquiry in 1916, Ambedkar articulated a gendered and sexual analysis of the construction of caste through the mechanism of endogamy in India. This sex-gender caste trouble deployed women's biological sex and their social roles as wives and mothers to produce and reproduce the economy of caste. As such, this complex regulated women's sexuality, social mobility, and economic resources, safeguarding the privilege and power of the highest caste, that is the Brahmin caste man. It consolidated Brahmanism by reinforcing Brahmin exceptionalism and Brahmin ideals, hierarchizing caste practices, and engineering discrepancies in social and sexual labor. Ambedkar argued that women were the gateways to the caste system, and managing the unmarriageable units, that system was key to its efficacy. Endogamy was achieved mainly through the regulation and control of women's sexuality, such that caste enclosed and maintained not only the purity of blood, that's the biology, but also the purity of the being, that is the psychosociology. Women's sexual subordination was institutionalized by ancient male lawgivers as well as by kinship. And so Ambedkar exposed the strong ties between sexuality and sociality. He argued that, and I quote, sati, enforced widowhood, and girl marriage are customs that were primarily intended to solve the problem of the surplus man and woman in a caste and to maintain endogamy by preventing them from transgressing the boundaries of caste. Ambedkar also analyzed ancient literature to put forth a passionate critique of the lower position of Dalits as well as of Hindu women. He examined the educational, social, and gender discrimination and the ongoing degradation of lower castes and of all women. To fight the organic connection between caste and sex inequality and the closing of certain caste groups against others, many touchable and Dalit radicals, including Ambedkar, underscored intercaste or mixed marriages. Ambedkar forcefully argued, and I quote, "The real remedy for breaking caste is intermarriage. Nothing else will serve as a solvent of caste." End quote. The political strategy of intercaste marriages would annihilate caste distinctions, weaken the identity of the community, and enable women to secure their sexual rights. Working with these political practices, some women married outside their caste, yet we also see that many also reinforced endogamy. Ambedkar also revealed the problems in Manu's law of divorce, and I quote, "Many Hindus also thought of Manu that marriage is a sacrament and therefore did not allow divorce. This is, of course, far from the truth. His law against divorce had a very different motive. It was not to tie up a man to a woman, but it was to tie up the woman to a man and to leave the man free." End quote. Ambedkar thus articulated a powerful critique of Brahmanical patriarchy and the sanctity of Hindu marriage, which could not be violated by divorce. Moreover, he valued a woman's individual choice and construed marriage as a social contract, an agreement between women and men that could be broken at will, a radical notion at that time. Certainly, a new epoch of Dalit womanhood was truly dawning. So it is here I move to my second theme of forging a new, ideal, respectable Dalit womanhood. Respectful Dalit womanhood was predicated on education and building self-respect, self-reliance, improvement, and humanity, dignity, in contrast with the modern but modest and mellow and dependent woman as constructed by high caste touchables. Women's education was at the core of social reform, and Ambedkar stressed the significance of knowledge and understanding for both girls and boys. He argued, and I quote, "Knowledge and learning are not for men alone. They are essential for women too. You must remember that if you want improvement and progress for future generations, education of girls is very important." End quote. Ambedkar emphasized women's cultivation of the intellect and self-development for personal freedom. He argued that without education and improvement, women would be unable to provide intelligent training to their children. Continuing the efforts of early Dalit radicals, Ambedkar intimately connected the private and public realms of Dalit women. As a result, many Dalits approached educational opportunity from a profound sense of shared responsibility. And dignity here is the conscious creation of an embodied consciousness in everyday political practices, especially through a commitment to education. Ambedkar also forged a masculine Dalit womanhood, in contrast to Brahmin patriarchal prescriptions of genteel behavior for ideal Indian womanhood. In this construction, Ambedkar and other Dalit radicals emphasized Dalit women's fortitude and independence, which stood in stark contrast to the touchable construction of women as dependent and fickle. Ambedkar championed women's equality with men and their supposedly masculine qualities of mental tenacity, resoluteness, willpower, and daring, highlighting these qualities, for instance, in his address to the gathering of Dalit women at the Mahad Conference in December 1927, that I quoted at the beginning. While touchables conceived of women as naturally destructive, deceptive, and libidinous, and thus perceived women's agency as a negative social force, Ambedkar constructed Dalit women as agents of a positive social change, both for themselves and the larger Dalit community. Although Ambedkar, like M.K. Gandhi, idealized women as models of purity, patience, and self-sacrifice, he distinguished himself from his contemporary by delimiting women's capacity for creating their self-respect, self-reliance, and daring, which were most important to building Dalits' humanity and dignity. Many touchables and British citizens commonly viewed Dalits with contempt, and Ambedkar was keenly aware of the ways these ruling classes had essentialized and oppressed both Dalits on the basis of caste and women according to ideas of gender and sexuality. They tended to regard Dalit men as submissive, fatalistic, and of low intellect, and Dalit women as vulgar, unruly, and of loose morals. To counter this dominant discourse, Dalit radicals sought to create a more assertive and moral persona for members of the Dalit community, which in case of women meant adopting what was considered more masculine attributes. So that is daring, willpower, confidence, resoluteness. These, it was held, would further their quest for rights, their sense of self, and their dignity. So Ambedkar appealed to Dalit women to work on their education and self-empowerment and self-reliance. He wanted women and men to become more masculine, that is, more self-conscious and self-confident in order to make their own destiny in a daring and determined manner. So he's not asking women to just, grow a lot of muscle or grow mustaches or beards and so on and so forth. But here, masculinity and being masculine is the very ways in which he's telling them to be more confident and to be self-reliant. And we need to understand that, these were the times, and just globally, how women were not allowed to participate in the public realm. And here we come across Dalit women who have been denied the basic human right. And this is what Ambedkar is trying to argue for. He seemed to draw upon the problematic conceptions of masculinity and femininity that were almost universal among Indian political figures, including some feminists during the period. As a result, he argued that both women and men were capable of daring and self-respect, though these qualities were depicted as masculine in nature. Ambedkar exhorted women to rethink their attitudes towards education, motherhood, public roles, and employment. He encouraged them to find a new voice through women's conferences and active involvement in protests. In all, he sought to initiate a radical change in their historical circumstances and voice produced in the crucible of domestic and public politics. Dalit radicals thus departed from both the right-wing Hindu discourse that advocated for the construction of an aggressive masculinity to protect vulnerable women and the Gandhian ascetic agenda for the desexualization of either the self or of the woman. By looking upon women as equal partners in the fight for justice, Ambedkar opened significant spaces for Dalit women's sustained political commitment. He encouraged women to participate in the nonviolent resistance that he launched to fight for common civic rights for Dalits, such as those to gain access to public temples, streets, and water tanks. For example, more than 10,000 Dalit women and men attended the All India Conference of the Boycotted held in Nagpur from May 30th to June 1st, 1920. The conference passed significant resolutions on compulsory education, ending the consumption of alcohol, and carrying, skinning, and eating the dead animals of the Hindus, and most importantly, demanding political representation. Ambedkar also placed the burden of social responsibility and of ending untouchability on Dalit women. And I quote, he argued, "The problems of annihilation of caste and everyday life must be tackled by women and men together. Women must attend conferences and help in this project of emancipation. To tell the truth, the task of removing untouchability belongs not only to men, but to you, women." End quote. Thus, Ambedkar pulled respectable women into the political public sphere. But at the same time, he expressed his cultural and gendered anxiety and authority vis-a-vis caste and gender in early 20th century India. leading to some contradictions in his attitudes towards women. On the one hand, he made the project of ending untouchability the responsibility of men and women, thus asserting gender equity and companionship. On the other hand, by arguing that the task of removing untouchability belonged to women, he seemed to undercut men by suggesting the superior moral and physical strength of women. Ambedkar's declaration of women's advantage in the service of a radical Dalit agenda at one level echoes the move by touchable nationalists like Gandhi to define and mobilize, in this case, the bodies and actions of women, as well as discourses about femininity in the service of their elite nation-building agenda. However, Gandhi never looked upon Dalit women as agents, and his patronizing and paternalistic and elite agenda rarely included Dalit women specifically, and only served to reinforce Dalit dependence on touchables. By contrast, Ambedkar identified woman as the helpmeet of man, thus making her empowerment a primary political task. This suggests the complicated and differential positioning of women within Dalit modernity. He did accept certain gender duties, but at the same time, he also challenged patriarchy to enhance women's autonomy. He argued, and I quote, "She should underscore equality in a man-woman relationship and refuse forcefully to act like his slave. If you act on this advice, you will attain high respect and honor. Further, you will also improve the honor and dignity of the community." End quote. So Ambedkar underscored women's individuated subjectivity, freedom, and equality with men. His commitment to woman-man equality also found an important place in the 22 vows he would give neo-Buddhists during the conversion ceremony on October 14th, 1956. Inspired and transformed by these Ambedkarite winds of change, as articulated by the feminist Bebitai Kamre, many women, including Chandrika Bai Ramteke, Jai Bai Chaudhary, Sulochana Bai Dongre, Lakshmi Bai Naik, the sisters Sita Bai, Ramabai, and Gita Bai Gaikwad, Radha Bai Kamre, and Shanta Bai Dani, among many others, were fearless leaders agitating and organizing the All India Dalit Women's Congress, the All India Scheduled Caste Federation, and many more organizations. More than 500 women marched like disciplined soldiers, for example, at the start of the Nasik Satyagraha of 1930. As a result, as Parvatabai Meshram has argued, and I quote, "Women gained knowledge of the outside world. They became aware of injustice, oppression, and insult, and a sense of identity awakened in them." End quote. Consequently, as Bebitai Kamre asserts, the success of the Ambedkarite winds of change, and I quote, "Ambedkar's movement led to the creation of enthusiasm and activity, courage, determinacy, and positivity, as gradually one idea formed and sprouted forth many." End quote. These practices were immensely relevant to improving Dalit women's dignity, which was tightly bound to the pride of the larger Dalit community. Ambedkar also forged an intimate body politics to remake Dalit women's emotional and corporeal selves. New respectable Dalit women repossessed their bodies and created new voices for themselves. A significant task for Ambedkar was the radical rejection of certain markers of untouchability associated with clothing, jewelry, naming, and housing, which was strictly policed by touchables. Ambedkar emphasized during the Mahad conference, and I quote, "You should abandon all old and filthy customs and rituals that provide recognizable evidence of untouchability. Certainly, untouchables do not possess a stamp of their untouchable status on their foreheads, but untouchables can be immediately identified due to their customs. Hence, you should abandon all such markers. Clothes reflect a more elegant appearance compared to jewelry, and hence you should spend on good clothing. You should make it a habit to drape saris like the highest caste woman. Change your style of draping the sari before you go home." End quote. To Ambedkar, in order to modernize, Dalits had to annihilate minor cultural distinctions that indicated their caste status. He clearly analyzed the ways caste embodied cultural difference. The caste mechanism commanded Dalits to appear different in order to be identified and further stigmatized. As a result, physical experiences of intentionally donning clean dress and fewer pieces of jewelry emerged as powerful practices of presenting Dalit women's transformed personhood, dignity, morality, and virtue. By giving up caste-specific stigmatized dressing styles and heavy jewelry, Dalit women asserted themselves against both Brahmanical caste and gender codes, as well as intercaste patriarchies. Dalits performed a higher status. Individually and on a collective level, through their robust body politics, as I call it. The politics of naming, of draping a full sari, of wearing footwear, of being clean, of standing straight, and of not being submissive in the presence of touchables was significant for Dalit self-respect, the transformation of their identity, and for displaying modernity. By appropriating high caste sari draping, Dalit women were not merely Sanskritizing or reinforcing touchable norms of proper femininity, rather they were contesting touchable status as the holders of value. Dalit women were not only resisting the dominant ideology, but also empowered a disempowered politics of positionality that had been rendered unthinkable by the dominant culture. Through their sartorial practices, Dalit women embodied their resistance, destabilizing and transforming dominant norms for their own political purposes. To constitute themselves anew at different and deeper levels in their struggle for full citizenship, honorable and respectful Dalit women intentionally desired to assume the traditional forms of full dress from which they had been excluded. In keeping with his admonishments to Dalit women, Ambedkar always wore a Western-style three-piece suit that I just showed you in the pictures earlier, and also assumed the title Sahib, usually reserved for an European officer. The political practice of donning a full sari in public was significant in the remaking of the Dalit self and the Dalit community. Dalit women's intentional performance of their sartorial desire, hitherto the purview of touchables, threatened the latter's historic identity. In 1942, Ambedkar noted the radical change in the dress, manners, and speech of about 20 to 25,000 Dalit women, all dressed in full saris, present at the All India Depressed Classes Conference in Nagpur. Nevertheless, these processes were and are tenuous, and moreover, they were subject to a double bind. Dalit women's subjection was simultaneously produced and restrained by the very structures of power through which emancipation was sought. In speaking on and exercising his authority to speak on the Dalit woman question, Ambedkar expressed his anxieties about the implications of modernity for Dalits. Dalit radicals depicted women's inferior position as paradigmatic of Indian social decay, which boded ill for the Dalit community and the larger Indian nation, and in so doing, they burdened Dalit women with upholding the moral order of the Dalit community and the Indian nation. The anxiety and authority of male radicals raised as many questions about women and gender roles as it resolved. A serious problem for radicals and reformers was how to simultaneously create and support educated and autonomous women while restricting their potential roles to those of wives and mothers and eliminating those of non-wives and prostitutes. Ambedkar also intervened in the legal realm. And as I noted in the beginning, he was the main architect of the Indian Constitution. He also was a law minister. Continuing his work for women's rights as a labor minister and law minister, Ambedkar drafted laws such as the Mines Maternity Bill in 1941 and insisted on equal wages, welfare for women, and representation for all women. He also emphasized equal citizenship and women's right to economic development. His efforts for the empowerment of women and seeing them as individual humans culminated in drafting the Hindu Code Bill that was deliberated upon from 1947 to 1951. As he argued, this greatest social reform measure caused him the greatest mental torture, and he officially resigned from the cabinet in 1951. He explained, and I quote, "To leave inequality between class and class, between sex and sex, which is the soul of Hindu society, untouched, and to go on passing legislation in relation to economic problems is to make a farce of a new constitution and to build a palace of dung heap. This is the significance I attached to the Hindu code," end quote. Ambedkar was thus continuously troubled by the intersections of sex, sexuality, gender, and caste. As a result, he wanted to attack, and he attacked the social roots of these problems. Although he focused more on the most vulnerable Dalit women, he worked on the political and sexual rights for all Indian women. I repeat, for all women. He recognized and fought for Dalit women's political rights, but at the same time, he also restricted their sexual rights inside monogamous marriage and affirmed the honor and control of community. Yet, he openly challenged the confines of community as well as the Brahmanical patriarchy of the state by arguing for intercaste marriages and building bridges across caste communities. These efforts further consolidated in the Hindu Code Bill. It threatened Brahmanical patriarchy, which was rooted in compulsory endogamy, the absence of women's right to property, no dissolubility of marriage for women, and sanctioned polygamy. The bill worked to address these issues on two fronts. It sought to diversify systems and practices of inheritance and it streamlined marriage and divorce laws. So the Hindu code thus opened the possibility of mixed marriages and allowed women the right to divorce. It allowed them the right to inheritance. And Touchables opposed this bill bitterly. In conclusion, the double binds of making choices under constraints, of potentials and restraints, and of anxiety and ambiguity accompanied the constitution of Dalit women as persons. Dalit women's agency belonged to them as well as to the culturally specific and historically contingent arrangement of power in which they were located. Ambedkar expanded and further complicated the terrain of gender and in fact of the political by focusing on constituting the ideal Dalit woman. He revised gendered norms and constructed deep connections between family, household structures, and the larger processes of reforming caste, community, region, and nation. He did not dwell only on sex-specific oppressions, but took into consideration women's roles as individuals and political and legal citizens dealing with the broader political issues that affected women, community, and the nation as a whole. He inaugurated a historic change, and he departed from touchable models of genteel womanhood, challenged Brahmanical patriarchy, and forged an alternative, a new, respectable, and masculine Dalit womanhood. He consistently worked to raise women's status, ultimately constituting them as good citizens of modern India. Dalit political actions thus teach us to seriously consider the household familial relationships and their complex engagement with the larger historical, social, and political concerns of caste, race, community, and nation. Indeed, the anchoring of feminist solidarity requires such common responsibility, common interests, and interconnectedness among women and men inside the family and among different communities. I thank you all